Hi, this is Ann V. Brady, and I will be discussing my book, A New Beginning, The Story of My Adoption, Life, and Service, illustrated by Eric C. Brady. Something I wanted to talk about today that I've mentioned in my book uh, is the fact that the social workers told, according to my mother, told her that, and my father, that my parents had died. Now, I have high regard for the Department of Social Services, and I'm not going after social workers or anything. And hopefully, things have changed since the 1950s and 60s because they tended to do that kind of stuff. But, you know, they didn't tell the truth to my parents, and I'm sure that some of them may have not told the truth because it was department policy uh, to not tell the parents everything about the adopted child. My mother never knew that I had been in a hospital, even though, according to my social worker information file, it said that I lived for a year in the hospital before I was put in foster home because of a failure to thrive. They told my parents that, my adoptive parents, my mom and dad, that my birth parents had died in a car accident. My birth mother was single, and she had two children out of wedlock. Uh, and she didn't die till 1980. Uh, I didn't start searching until 1990. But and it wasn't just in Massachusetts; it was rampant. Uh, my mother-in-law, Anita Brady, told me that one time she was a court reporter, and she went into some government office to turn in some transcripts, and the secretary there had a birth certificate, and she was going through the phone book, and my mother-in-law said she asked the woman about that, and she said, oh, when a child is put up for adoption, placed in the orphanage, when they're looking, they, instead of keeping the child's name and letting the parents choose the name when they adopt them or before they adopt them, they go through the phone book to, they were going through the phone book to pick a name for the child so they could change it so that when the child got older after he was adopted, because his name would change from adoption, that he wouldn't be able to find his birth mother. It supposedly was to keep it, protect her privacy. And I'm not so sure about that because I know many parents or birth mothers and some birth fathers who have later in life gone and searched for their birth child that they gave up. Sometimes because they were teenagers at the time and they were forced to give the child up and they never wanted to give the child up. But hopefully that has changed it's not rampant in these current years in the 2025 and so forth 2000s because a parent should adoptive parents should know that the child they're adopting has been in the hospital, that they don't necessarily know who the birth mother is unless it's an open adoption where the birth parents and the adoptive parents meet each other, etc. There have been that in the last several decades, which is a good thing. But they do need to know some family medical history, maybe. Uh, they need to know if the child was in the hospital. They need to know if that child has serious problems, medical problems, because that could affect their decision. And I know that's part of the reason I believe social workers don't tell the parents is they don't want to discourage parents from adopting children, and so they don't tell them everything. Uh, but I think they should. It should be full disclosure as far as medical problems, emotional problems, if the child was born with fetal alcohol syndrome or drug addiction and they're now fine or whatever. They need to know that because they need to know if the child needs special care. The other thing I want to discuss is the fact about normal children and people assuming a child has mental deficiencies. Uh, I do know that in my file it says that a social worker, a doctor, when I was put in the hospital, when they gave me a full medical exam before I was to be adopted by my family, uh, the doctor there told the social worker he thought that I might be retarded, and that's the term they used back then, mentally deficient, because I sat there quietly and let him, you know, investigate me, treat me and, check on me and everything. I didn't give up a fight or show any interest. And she told him it was because I was shy and that I had bad experiences with the foster families and everything. So that would explain, and I didn't have much exposure to people. So that might explain why. In other words, she didn't bother telling me I lived in a hospital for a year. So possibly that might have made me kind of blasé because if I lived a year in a hospital, they probably investigated me a million times, you know, to check up on me, make sure I was healthy and surviving and growing normally and everything else and growing blood and everything else. So I was probably used to it. It had nothing to do with intelligence, you know. So doctors don't need to assume that because a child acts a certain way, there might be a mental problem with them, you know. But the social worker again omitted the fact that I lived in a hospital for a year. And, he should have known that. And that would have changed his opinion as to whether I was of average intelligence, above average intelligence, or mentally deficient. You know, you can't assume, and you need to have all the facts. But that's basically it. That and the fact that the social workers never told my birth parents that I had a brother. Because when I told my mom I had a brother, even though she said, "Well, now you know everything. You can stop searching now." She did say that if she had known I had a brother, they would have asked to adopt him also. But at that time, he would have been 8, and it wasn't until 9 or 10 that he was unceremoniously dropped off at an orphanage and basically abandoned by the foster family and everybody else into the system. But I just wanted to let people know how I feel about that and explain that sometimes that I think the social workers should tell the parents, prospective adoptive parents, what they're getting into when they adopt a child. What they need to know, the good and the bad and the ugly, basically to speak. But and that's just my opinion, and everybody is entitled to their own opinion. And if you feel differently, feel free to respond or tell me what you think, and I will honor that. Just be nice and courteous and no foul language or disparagement to anybody. Okay? We can agree to disagree. If you like what I said, fine. If you don't, sure, tell me and post it. But don't be derogatory towards me or anybody else. And I hope everybody has a great week and a wonderful life. And peace out.